Hello, welcome to Jordan Sorcery's GW Books Club. In this club, we're reading all 17 of the original GW books released between 1989 and 1991. This month, we're reading Plague Daemon by Brian Craig, the second story in the Orfeo trilogy, and it's an interesting one. Before my friend Stu and I get into our discussion, here is a quick overview of the main plot points. Orfeo and his fellow captive Maro have attempted to escape the palace of the Lord of the Twin Seas, Al-Qadi Nazreen, but make little headway through the desert of Araby before they are recaptured. Nazreen is frustrated that his minstrel captive would try and escape, especially after being so nice to him, and so he demands another tale from this master minstrel, one that might help him understand the pervasions of chaos that had corrupted his brother in the previous story, Zaragoz. Orfeo knows of only one such tale, a narrative that tells of an invasion into a border prince's empire and the machinations of the chaos god Nurgle. Harmis Detz and his brother were border guards of the Cyprian Empire in the Border Princes, having spent their lives on the lookout for signs that the hillman tribes of the Zani might be massing for an invasion from the Black Mountains. On a supernaturally foggy night, that very invasion begins, and whilst Harmis is knocked out, his brother and his unit are all killed. Following the trail of the attackers, Harmis discovers that they are not Zani, but in fact mutants, and that they are heading towards the home of Astyanax, the wizard. The mutants attack and kill Astyanax, but not before he wipes them out with the aid of his apprentices, and also the timely intervention of Harmis, who stealthily dispatches the Chaos Sorcerer that leads this mutant band. With his dying breath, Astyanax reveals that Harmis has been cursed by the Sorcerer, and that his fate is now entwined with that of a Plague Daemon, to whom the Sorcerer was servant. That demon seeks to destroy Cypria, and now Harmis, with the help of the apprentices, must use all of his power to kill this demon and save the Cyprian people. Harmis, Nicodemus, and Averil ride towards that capital city, sending on word that the invasion has come and the bridges must be destroyed. They also seek to find another wizard, Ritandir, who might guide them in facing the Plague Daemon. On the way, Harmis is injured and they encounter some wounded soldiers with a beautiful nurse called Asmunda. Harmis accepts a gold coin from Asmunda in return for his kindness, little realizing that it is infected with the plague that he is about to carry into the city. The party manage to stay ahead of the full-blown invasion by the Zani, and they meet up with the wizard Ritandir, who discovers this infected coin. Whilst Harmis joins the soldiers who are fighting off the Zani on the destroyed bridge, the wizard and his apprentices cast magics to try and stop the plague. The Zani's progress is halted, but it is too late to stop the plague from spreading to the capital, and after the Plague Daemon kills Ritandir, our heroes have no choice but to follow it to the capital as well. There, they discover that the plague has already decimated the population, wiped out the royal household, and killed the Prince of Cypria. Using the true name of the demon, Yastareth, that the late wizard had told Harmis, he is able to defeat it, though not before Nicodemus sacrifices himself. Cypria is saved, Harmis becomes prince, and Averil his queen. But many of its people are dead from plague or invasion. Orfeo's tale, however, ends on a note of hope that people will build again. Though not satisfied that he now understands chaos, the Lord of the Twin Seas finally grants the minstrel his freedom in thanks for the story he has been told. Stu, so Plague Daemon, second of the Orfeo tales. What did you think overall to this one?
I struggled for quite a long time. I think you messaged me a week or so ago talking about how to get on with it, and I still at that point hadn't made my mind up about the whole book, and I think it's because I struggled for quite a while. Even up to sort of halfway through, I was still finding it a little bit of a chore. I felt it quite slow, and the change from the setup at the beginning to what the story was actually about. I mean, spoilers, is the Orfeo trilogy, and it's not really about Orfeo at all, and it doesn't feel like Orfeo needs to be part of the story. And I think that threw me a little bit. And I probably spent a few chapters trying to work out why the author had gone down that route. And it's not terrible, and it does get better. And I did enjoy the second half of most of the second half of the book. So it's not awful. It's not a terrible novel in the grand scheme of novels, but out of all of the ones we've read so far, there was a longer period. I was thinking, oh, okay, this is not a chore, but getting close to a chore to read at times.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because I think we've had a sort of similar experience with this one, but we've ended in a different place because I also came into it and I was a bit worried once it first sort of set the stage with the Orfeo framing device. In Zaragoz, it felt like Orfeo's presence and the framing device with Orfeo. He'd been captured. He's talking to Nazarene, the Lord of the Twin Seas, and he's telling his own tale of this place that he has been to. It's a really fun setup. In this one, we kind of have a weird bungled escape attempt, and then he's back in the sort of cell, and he's back telling a story again. And it did not fill me with confidence at the start of the tale because it just felt like this was totally unnecessary.
Yeah, I thought this story is going to be where he goes after he escapes. And I quite enjoyed it. I thought, oh, brilliant. So rather than jumping to a different time period completely, it carries on right from the last book. We're going to see him escape, and then he's going to go on. And his next adventure maybe will be a live adventure rather than him recounting a tale. And then when he got captured, I thought, oh, it's going to be the same setup as last time, telling another story about himself. And then it was like, oh, he's not even telling a story himself. He's telling a story about someone else, and that someone else was okay. I mean, this is going to probably sound harsh, but it felt a little bit like you can imagine him, the author, flicking through his calendar and going, "Oh, I've got a deadline in a month for this book's supposed to be in. I haven't written anything, but I have got this extended novella here." Yeah, and if I just add Orfeo at the beginning and at the end in an epilogue, ba-bang, I've got Orfeo true too.
It did feel, the framing device at least, conceptually, I really like it. So I actually do like that idea of what if you have a great storyteller who, for his life, has to tell these great tales? That's a fun idea. In Zaragoz, again, it ties into the story he's like he has to tell this story and it has to be good because of the stakes that exist. In this one, because we're now just replaying the situation, the stakes don't feel quite as high. It didn't feel quite as well drawn as a set of circumstances. One thing I did like though was the sort of the through line from Zaragoz being Nazarene wants to know what happened to his brother. Why did his brother turn evil? Why did he fall to the nebulous forces of chaos that existed in Zaragoz? Can Orfeo explain that through a story? And this is the one story that Orfeo knows where the protagonist has been influenced by or engaged in a battle with chaos. And I quite liked that as a setup outside of the Orfeo framing. The actual fact that this was a story, a true story, as it were, of somebody who faced chaos and won. That was a fun sort of starting point. But then we get into this story of Harmis Detz, the border guard in this border prince's region, Cyprian Empire, not a place that really turns up very much in future Warhammer lore. It does a couple of times, which is fun. It's on a few maps here and there, but it's not really part of the lore. But because it's the border princes, I think it kind of worked because it's this kind of backwater, almost sort of Deadwood style frontier empire that comes and goes. I'm sensing that you.
I don't. Yeah, and I don't want to jump in and interrupt you. I don't think it is that. I think that's what it should be, but I don't think that's the way it's described. For a start, I know you can use the term empire meaning different things. You could a musical empire, an empire of retail stores, or something. Empire normally means, especially when you're talking about lands and cities and towns, usually means a pretty substantial amount of land. You don't describe something as an empire when it's very, very small very often. And then there is a fairly sizable, the way it's described, city and then smaller towns and things. And that's never been what the Border Princes has been about. And I thought, so basings, my personal old Warhammer, the old world Bretonians in the Border Princes. I've done a little bit of reading about it recently. There is a danger here that I'm going to come across, and I think you'll find that's not what I'm trying to do. But it because of that, it did throw me a little bit again about whether this Cyprian Empire was depicted in the way it should be. So again, it felt too big in the Border Princes. The Border Princes should be small walled towns, really. I think in one of the resources I read, might be one of the old Wolfrock, might be in second edition, but I'm sure it says sort of rarely more than 500, maybe 1,000 people living in these places, and this felt bigger. And I reach across to this bad boy here, to Border Princes, and it says cities. There are no settlements of city size. So, even what he'd be working from. So I thought, I'm probably not wrong in my assumption then, that describing this big city, and then the other towns, there was a battle before they got to the city. I've written the search for my notes, because there's far too many unfamiliar names in this that you don't remember. And it begins with a C, Cava something or other, the Battle of Camelot. So, and that was big enough place to have a walled town, that there was as a battle there as well. So it felt too big. Yeah, for me, maybe only marginally, but the idea that there was this sprawling empire, and I didn't know whether that had appeared in the lore more. I think you mentioned Tamarkan, but Tamarkan's almost Warhammer lore adjacent anyway, isn't it? It's an alternative, and it's kind of lore.
It's the Lost Empire.
It's on the map. The road is there. It's in the new Warhammer World map. I checked it out. The road's still there, but has it ever been more than a road, more than a river? And has he gone too far with almost turning it into what he's often accused of is, we're going to an area that we don't know much about, so that he can transplant his story into without any fear of going wrong. But I think by assuming he's free to do whatever he wants to, maybe he's aimed a little bit bigger. Maybe I'm just overthinking it, but for me,
that's definitely fair. No,
threw me out of the story a bit as well.
Yeah, and I think use of the term empire, and there's a number of settlements, and there's a border guard. It's a lot more structured than we might expect. What I think worked for me, and how I was able to sort of square that away, was that everything we actually learn about the Cyprian quote unquote empire is that it's not the empire. It doesn't have loads of people. Like the scale of the towns and the villages, even the ones that have been devastated, and the number of people that we're talking about it's not that big ultimately.
It's mostly there. Yeah, I don't disagree with you, actually. It is mostly there. I think the city may be too much. But the other thing it's missing is other princedoms, there's other rogue barons and dukes, generally fairly close together.
Sure.
And it's usually one settlement with a couple of small things.
It's certainly a bit of a
and things like that. But it's a large area as well. But we don't come across any of the other. The idea is there's a real mismatch in the Border Princes as well. So there's orcs and goblin tribes and things. And it mentioned orcs a couple of times. But I think it was generally fine. But I think that to feel like the Border Princes, you feel like you should butt up against lots more smaller settlements of differing factions. And it didn't feel like that. It felt like there was this empire that was ordered, and then these raiders from sort of coming down from
I totally understand where you're coming from. I maybe was able to sort of forgive it a little bit more, but maybe because I wanted this to be a fun Warhammer Borderlands tale. It was difficult for me to get around some of the naming conventions. So besides Empire, and even the Kypris and the Cyprian Empire didn't sound that Warhammery to me. And then you had the tribesmen that you talked about, the hill people who come and invade every now and again, called the Zani. And they've got these big aurochs, these big sort of wildebeest sort of creatures. You've then got a lot of character names that did not feel like they belonged to me in the Warhammer world. So Astinax was the wizard. That's maybe you could get away with it.
Sounds Dragonlance-ish.
It is cool. Yeah, exactly. And then obviously a Nicodemus, that's fine. Avaril is okay. But we sort of Lavarok and Harmis and some of these names. Ritandir was the other wizard.
And that just sounds like a pharmaceutical drug that's had a scandal, doesn't it?
They just didn't quite I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but they didn't quite sound or feel like
Mm.
Warhammer to me. And especially in quick succession in some of the earlier exposition where we got place names and people's names, there were a lot of
Yeah.
other things as well that had names that I didn't recognize. So when the wizard Astyanax explains what's going on and we're being attacked by these, worshippers of chaos essentially, but it's not a chaos sorcerer, it's a Lazarite. And
What's
that's
that?
never explained why that term exists and why they've got their own language for it. And maybe you could say that's cool world building. This is a unique place in the old world with its own terms, but they also have their own names for chaos demons.
Yeah.
And so you have all of this stuff where you could have just said it's a demon, but you don't. It's got its own. I can't remember the specific term now, and I don't think I've written it down. But it sort of sounds like
The
a chaos, but it's not quite.
is
So
it
yeah, I mean it's not.
Kytheros or something
Yeah,
like that?
something of that nature.
Because at one point it has three names.
Yes, it's got
Because
several
it's
names.
Asamunda, Kytheros, and then I named her Yasreth or something. It's like,
Yeah. So if at first you kind of this feel of like an 80s family fantasy movie, or a sci-fi movie like Last Starfighter or something like that, where you just get a big exposition dump of like, here's all of these wild names and wonderful places, and we've done it this way to try and build a world instantly. And it did feel awkward. And it took a while for me to really get into the story. Kind of like you were saying, it was clunky early on. It didn't feel very organic. We had a main character, so Harmis, has a familial relationship. His brother dies instantly, and Harmis is not that cut up about it. He's very like practical. I'm a soldier. I just need to carry on with my mission. I'm going to follow the attackers.
Yeah.
There's a bit of like, there's a bit of sadness, but he sees his brother's body and is just very like matter of fact about it.
Yeah.
And once he gets involved with the wizard and the apprentices, and he sort of goes on his quest, he spends a lot of time not wanting to be on the quest as well, which made him a difficult character to like, I thought.
Yeah, I don't think I ever liked him. I didn't dislike him either. I just didn't have any. There's no depth to the character. It almost reads like. So you said it's like an 80s film setup at the beginning, but then it almost gets quite grim.
Very grim, yeah.
It's like a grim medieval drama, though. So you kind of go from, so from an 80s film setup to something that you might see as a BBC Two drama set in the Middle Ages or something for a while, but not big budget, and it's kind of grim and it's okay, but it's lacking that kind of wider story depth. And some of that was good. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. Some of that grimness was quite well written at times. But I found the writing pace changes quite a lot. I don't know if you've picked up on this, and I've only thought about this for this story he's done. So you'll have these well written. Some of the fight scenes were quite good, quite well written, but then he has these really deep, sort of almost pseudo intellectual conversations with people at points where they wouldn't have it, and he does it a lot. They kind of, but it's almost beyond the kind of Bond-esque villains talking to each other. They almost have this philosophical debate about things, and it's just pages of chatter before something happens. And it's like it seems to get lost in that writing, and it doesn't fit the Warhammer style of story. It's almost like, I'm a better writer than this. I want to sort of juxtapose this kind of thing in there. I don't know.
Where I would disagree, I think. So I do agree with some of that, but where I disagree, I think, is Harmis as a character. As much as I didn't like him as a person, especially because, like you say, some of the grim, very brutal, quite pragmatic, but really brutal combat, and he's willing to sacrifice a family in order to get an edge on some people who are following. And that's quite hard to like that character as a result of that. But where I thought the depth came from for him was his sort of the conflict he has internally about his duty and what he ought to be doing in this an invasion into the empire. but he's also got this magical quest. He doesn't understand the magical quest, so he really doesn't want to be involved. He wants to fight the invaders because that's all he knows. So it's very
Yeah.
like, this is my life and what I want to do because I understand it. So I quite liked that, and that he feels a bit guilty about sacrificing the family of travelers in order to get that edge. And
Yes.
there's some stuff there where it's kind of, there's a bit more depth to him, but where I thought it struggled because he's the only character who has any depth, and even then you have to want it. So he has the most conversations with Averil, I think, the sort of female apprentice, the female lead of the story, if you like, but not really, because she doesn't have much character herself. She has a number of positions on a couple of things that are happening throughout the story. She disagrees with a lot of stuff. There just wasn't a well-rounded character for her, which meant Harmis couldn't have proper conversations and interesting conversations because there wasn't enough time, I think, spent sort of rounding out her character more.
It's the same with all the female characters, to be honest with you, isn't it? I thought it was something else I noticed. They almost introduce that within the first line or two of every female character being introduced, he's describing them on how pretty they are. So it's almost like, this one's pretty, this one's not. And when they're not pretty, they're a bit grumpy. And when they're pretty, they're often mischievous. It's very, very basic level and quite stereotypical stuff.
It is.
But it's amazing how many times that as soon as the female is introduced, within the first couple of lines, he's told you whether they're attractive or not. And whether he thinks that all males work that way, maybe there is some element of the way people look at the superficiality of people's appearance and things. But it made me chuckle reading it, just thinking, oh my God, there's another line where someone else comes along.
It did. I did chuckle about this as well at one point in particular, but the reason I can forgive that is because it does feel like quite a sort of misogynistic approach to all of the female characters, but because we see them from Harmis's perspective, it's always Harmis who is thinking, is she attractive or is she not? Averil is bland and boring, therefore she's annoying, sort of thing. And
it's the narrator saying that, not always. I suppose the narrator is retelling Harmis's tale.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's Orfeo telling what Harmis has said. So Harmis said,
because you're not hearing it in Orfeo's voice very often.
Sure,
it's easy to get.
You definitely have to want
even
to
get lost
see it
in
that way. Yeah, I'd say that's fair. And the reason I chuckled is because much later on in the story, when we find out that one of the female characters is actually the demon in disguise, the first thing that he says when he discovers that he's going to have to go and try and find and kill the demon in its female form is he's like, okay, I guess we're gonna have to go and find the lovely Asmunda and kill her. Like he cannot help himself from commenting on her.
Maybe that's her kind of title. Maybe she sells that like a trademark. It's like the lovely Debbie McGee. It's kind of that's just aged me. But I don't. Yeah, it was odd. It carried that on quite a while into knowing that he was a demon.
Yeah, but the demon stuff. And this is where I think we sort of, our perception or enjoyment of the book maybe goes in different directions, because there was a point when I suddenly fell in love with some of the plot devices that Brian Craig or Brian Stableford, writing as Brian Craig, actually found. Like what he created in a few moments were really, really clever, I thought, and interesting, like ways to leverage the fantasy universe. So we get Harmis and Averil, they've been on their quest. They have helped reluctantly helped some injured soldiers who are also fleeing this invasion. And that's where they've met for the first time Asmunda, who is actually the Plague Daemon in disguise. She's given Harmis this coin, and he's given them this horse to help them get to safety. Later on, once they're in the city, she turns up again, Asmunda, and she says, yeah, we managed to make it. The guys turned up. And then we find out that there's a plague that's arrived in the town, and the plague probably started with 3 injured soldiers who just arrived that day. So now Harmis is sort of racked with guilt about, did the soldiers that I helped, I gave this horse to them so they could get here, did they bring a plague into the city? And then on top of that, when Ritandir, the other wizard who turns up, and he does a spell to try and find the the Plague Demon. And he gets quite confused. He's like, it's almost like the Plague Demon's in the room with us. And it turns out that it's the coin that has been given to Hermes, which he's been kind of like, he's been like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, where he's been like, it's a bit precious. He doesn't want to spend it. He keeps on thinking about it and saying, no, I'm not going to tell anyone about it. It turns out that that coin is actually the sort of infection vector or whatever it might be. That the coins are what carry the plague into the city, and that's why it's so widespread, because the Plague Demon has preyed on people's greed, even in this sort of end of the world situation where there's an invasion coming. People are still greedy for gold, and they'll still betray one another for it. And that is what's led to this mass infection of the plague across the entire city. And I thought that was really, really good. I thought it was really
I don't disagree. I really enjoyed that as well. And I probably liked the book from the Traveler's Attack. We'll call it that, because some of the terminology and language used in the book is of its time and a bit problematic now. But that whole period up into I definitely like the coin part, almost to them arriving at towards the end. I quite enjoyed that, but that's almost 100 pages in at that point, and it probably wasn't enough to rescue for me the first 100 pages of the book. At that style, at that time, I really liked it. I liked the feeling of the world. It didn't feel like the Border Princess, but I liked that grim medieval feel, the plague feel. It was good. I can imagine it on the screen. It was fine. There was nothing wrong with it. It's not bad writing as such there. That sums him up for me as an author. There's some really well written bits and some good devices with some very odd choices that mess with the pacing of the story at times, because you can maintain that all the way through. It'd have been an absolutely cracking story. It's just but it's not an Orfeo story. It should just be a different story, to be honest.
It's not an Orfeo story unless the pacing and structure is strange, I think, is what we're discovering.
Yeah, so maybe that's what it is.
That's how Orfeo likes to tell his tales. But there's what happens after that coin bit. So then there's some really interesting stuff around the city, and because they've had to take out the bridges because they were trying to stop the invasion, or at least that's what they think. So Astyanax the wizard had said you have to take all the bridges out immediately, and Hermes knows that everyone's too practical to do that. They'll take the bridges out at the last possible moment they can, ostensibly because this will protect individual, like the refugees and all that sort of stuff. The reality is actually there's money to be made and all that sort of stuff. So that's the sort of seedy grimness to the world as well. But the real reason
is realistic. It's good.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, the way the bridge they'd knocked out a few sections of it, but had a rope bridge across it, and they could still move people and soldiers across it, was quite good, I thought. And that sort of created an interesting situation for them to be in. But Astyanax the wizard wanted them to take the bridges out immediately because he knew there was going to be this plague demon. He knew it was coming. So that's quite cool. And I quite like that.
But he didn't say that, though. He could have said.
He could have said that. He was dying, to be fair. He was on his deathbed. So, but yeah, it was a shame that they didn't sort of think a bit more. Because there's also that quite interesting thing early on where the reason Hermes becomes the sort of chosen one in the story is because he has killed the Lazarite, the Chaos Sorcerer, and that's given him both a curse in quite a cool scene where the dying Lazarite Chaos Sorcerer like stares into his soul, and it's quite a good moment. And then his daggers now, because they've tasted the chaos blood, as it were, they are now enchanted weapons that will help them defeat the Plague Demon. But the way that they treat the blades and they treat the humans as well, Hermes and other people who are injured or affected by chaos, is using this Tarn wine, which is water from this lake in the mountains, which Astyanax has been working magic on for decades, it sounds like, and sort of imbuing with this magical healing property. All of that running story about Tarn wine and this black water that can heal you and protect you from chaos, I liked that as well. I thought that was quite cool.
The sort of subtle addictions to it. In fact, addiction comes up a few times in the story. There's a talk of the alchemists, and it was a petty alchemist, but he was a little bit too addicted to his own brews and things as well. So the frailties of the human nature come up quite a few times in it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then the sort of climax of the Tarn wine story for me was the next really clever plot point that I really enjoyed and was quite cinematic as well, which was where Ritande, having now discovered, right, the plague demon's over there, we know the coins have brought this infection into the city. What we're going to do is take control of a storm, and we're going to get it to like take up the Tarn water that's magically enhanced and rain it into the city and hopefully cure everybody and find the coins and do all this kind of cool stuff. But they're like, Harmon says, you're not a magic user. You need to get out of here. So he goes off and in a very cool sequence is defending the city at the bridge as the Zani, the hill tribes are attacking. They're swimming over. They're climbing up. The storm starts happening at the same time, and it's this magical storm. We know that it's all happening to try and do this cool stuff to protect everyone and cleanse the plague. It really felt really climactic and exciting to me. The two different strands of the sort of magical story and then the physical combat happening at the same time was really exciting and fun, I thought.
Yeah. Again, that was deep in the section of the story that was pretty good by that point.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wouldn't disagree at all. I did enjoy it then, and I'm glad the second half of the novel was like that. Otherwise, it would have been even more of a struggle.
How did you feel about the idea that because of the storm that's happening, there's a load of thunderclaps, and that actually causes all of these aurochs that have been mentioned many times as being the hill people? They bring these herds of beast, sort of buffalo or oxen or what have you. They bring them down with them. So there's loads of thousands of these things. They're behind the enemy lines. The thunderclouds cause them to stampede, Lion King style, into the back of the line and basically destroy the army that's invading because they get flattened by the stampede.
Yeah, I don't know. It felt a little bit convenient.
Quite convenient.
I'm not sure that was needed. I think you could have just said the storm was so bad that the waters rose or something and they could no longer attack and he clearly felt he needed to completely obliterate this army in some way or another. Maybe just the rainwater being so pure and being so objectable to the chaos tainted, maybe that would have worked as well. There's not enough, I don't think, I've made of the Zani. I mean, my brain just wanted to see them. They're just Chaos Marauders. I just want to see them as Chaos Marauders because that makes it feel Warhammery, and maybe they were, but you don't know because of the odd naming conventions that we've already alluded to. But yeah, if they were, that would have been more believable and more Warhammer, I suppose. Maybe you think like he went for something that felt more practical and less magical, but then also needed magic to make it happen, and it was just weird.
Yeah,
it's almost Lord of the Rings and the last charge of the Ents, and then the Huons, which are the more wild trees, come to life and attack the orcs and things. It just sort of came out of nowhere. So it's got elements of that to it as well, sort of the wildlife coming and reclaiming the land from these. I suppose the marauder would be an orc in the Tolkien way of thinking, which just means destructive power, destructive people, really. So I don't know. It is what it is. It wasn't the finest moment, but it was a fairly short moment in the story, I suppose.
Which was interesting as a choice in and of itself, right? Because it was very arbitrary and very quick. In an instant, the thunderclaps happened, the stampede happened, everybody knew, right, that's the Zani taken care of, the entire invasion's sorted, because actually the story is now going to move on to the magical plague, and that's going to be what propels us to the rest of the tale. And it was a shame almost for me, because one of the things I liked in the earlier sections that kept me invested, even though I didn't enjoy it as much as the back half of the book, was the idea that they were in the midst of an invasion. The invasion's behind them by a couple of days, but obviously word has spread, so everything is refugees everywhere. It's kind of the final days of this empire. People are fleeing. Devastation already happening.
Yes, and that was the best stuff. A lot of the best stuff was that real grim feeling. And like I said, it felt like a real medieval kind of think it was very, very. I can imagine it very well. It made me think of countless films and things I'd seen, and it was grim and it was depressing and it was realistic in its sort of the way it was written. So yeah, you took away all of that.
Yeah, but
it's maybe he wanted to do that. He wanted to clear everything, so it then becomes about the hero and the anti-hero.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it wasn't as elegant as it could have been with the Stampede stuff. It just didn't land quite well enough for me for that moment. I think it's fine. I think a magical resolution through something so practical as a Stampede could be quite cool, but it felt like an excuse to change the narrative focus. Fortunately, again, what we changed to was interesting enough for me to forgive that moment being a bit arbitrary, because what we then move into is, now that the invasion's over, we can go to the fortress at the capital and we could just fight the Chaos Demon. Unfortunately, the plague has now overtaken them, and actually they've got to go through this still devastated land because it's been ravaged by plague now, and all of that stuff is very grim and quite realistically drawn, where they are progressing through and they're seeing people who have been brought out onto the roadside. And he talks about how people they'll nurse some of these victims, but then they don't want to risk themselves, so they'll leave them on the roadside so that they share the guilt for not helping them, because passers-by will also not help them. So they don't just throw them out and not help them, they purposefully put them in the way of other people, so everyone shares that burden, which, I mean, is super interesting as like a really bleak kind of exploration of a medieval society.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it has parallels with lots of things in real life as well. And maybe he was trying to make a comment, or maybe on homelessness or something like that at the time. I can see there's parallels to that as well, isn't it? But yeah, it was grim and it worked. It wasn't a bad part of the story as well. So I was still hanging in there at this point, I think, and encouraged that there might be a good enough ending that made it feel Warhammerish enough or grim enough.
What did you think of Nicodemus? So this is the other apprentice. Averil is with Harmis for most of the story. Nicodemus is supposed to be more accomplished, but he doesn't really do very much most of the time.
No, he doesn't. I don't know. I think he was fine. I think the danger there is when you kill off Ritandir, which I suppose I don't know if you went on to describe that when you talked about the aftermath of that spell, because he kind of too much power there, wasn't there? He was like kind of a bit of a husk at the end of it, and he had died while casting that spell, and then the two apprentices were left, which I don't know. I didn't dislike either of the other two characters. I'm not sure I like the name Nicodemus, to be honest with you. I think it's too many names come up in too many other things. I'm sure he's come up in some comic books or something. So I don't know what the origins of the name, but I don't think it's this. Yeah, I don't know. It just sounds like an anti-smoking comic or something, doesn't it? I'm sure it was something about it. But I didn't dislike the character. I thought I thought you needed something there with Averil to show a different side. She was more practical, almost more healing type. And you need someone with a little bit of magic at times to do things that Harmis wasn't able to do. And I think that's why he was needed, and they weren't.
Yeah.
I think you could have rolled the two characters into one. You could have had Averil being Nicodemus as well. You could have quite easily have removed one character there and had her fulfill both those roles. But maybe that would have been too much depth for a female character.
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, that would have been a challenge, I imagine. But there is, because there's two interesting points of magic use, I thought. I mean, one was not her magic necessarily, but when Averil, they have to take refuge in a tavern with some refugees, and Harmis has been injured, so he's recovering at that time, and one of the refugees is pregnant, and because Averil is a quote unquote witch woman, they assume that she'll be able to help deliver the baby, and she does, but then the baby is delivered and it's a chaos mutant. So, and then the child and the mother both don't survive.
Both die, yeah.
Everybody blames Averil for it because she helped to deliver the baby. She's a witch woman. Maybe she influenced, like, with chaos magic, the child.
Yeah.
And I thought that then presented a really interesting moment that was going to be quite tense, and we were going to see, okay, how is this going to play out? It diffused itself very, very quickly, and there wasn't really an exploitation of that moment. The setup was good, though, and I thought it was an interesting idea.
I thought the whole bit was, I mean, I suppose the origins for that setup was it was the only bed in the village, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It was just quite amusing. He had to went at lengths to explain why that a wounded Harmis had to lie next to someone giving birth on the bed, which is a little bit strange. And maybe you could have still told that story with 2 beds in 2 rooms, with Averil still being asked to help deliver the baby, because they would be very natural to do. And in many ways, it may have even been better. It felt
well, but there was a moment of ambiguity, I thought, as well, where Harmis thinks that because he's been infected by chaos, maybe he's responsible for the chaos mutant. So there is an idea there that is quite cool, but again, it didn't really get explored that much.
Yeah, you felt like they should have been attacked and they were too scared to. And then I can understand the fear if they really thought she was a witch.
Sure.
And it did give them an excuse to have to suddenly leave. But it was at one point he was too ill to stand, and then this happened, and he was like, "We got to leave," but then had to sit back down again. But then you have a bit of a rest. He has a bit of a rest, and then he's all right. Because then nothing really super changed, is it? Other than maybe a few more hours.
But does that make you wonder if did they actually end up sacrificing the child unwittingly, but perhaps there was a trade made, and that's why Harmis, because he is very suddenly healthy again, healthy enough to travel, and like you say, he'd been flawed only moments earlier. So maybe whether it was Averil on purpose, whether it was Harmis and the curse, maybe it was something else, the Tarn wine, maybe even, who knows? But could there have been some moment of black magic?
Maybe if they did, that would have been good, but I'm not sure that was the intention.
No.
And so yeah, it's a cool thing to theorize, but I think it would be a good way of handling the sudden miraculous. But yeah, it could be. Maybe it was meant.
There was an exploration throughout the story about the trade-offs, and because Harmis is constantly thinking about like the duty and the trade-off for doing the duty and sort of all that sort of stuff, the sacrifices almost that must be made.
Yeah.
So maybe that could have played into that particular tale.
Yeah, maybe it was there. Maybe it was edited out. Maybe it was just trimmed and it lost some of the telling there. Maybe that was too long and it had to be trimmed, and that was one of the places it was taken from. But I still quite like that bit in it. Yeah,
it's an interesting moment.
That grim stage of it, wasn't it?
Very much so. Yeah. The other magical use was Nicodemus, and I don't know whether you were impressed or not, but he manages to slide the bolts of the sealed door to the fortress, like using magic from the other side of the door.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's a huge effort for him to do this. He seems really straining himself to do it. So how did you feel? Because I wasn't sure I enjoyed that. I thought it was a cool spell for a wizard to use, but was he didn't have any. He was such a weak wizard because he is just an apprentice. Is that cool or interesting? I don't know.
It seemed to be. There seemed to be quite a lot of dialogue and discussion and storytelling around a door. That Harmis was like, can't you just use some magic to open it? Have you played D&D? Come on. And they were like, well, no, it could be magically booby trapped, or it could be really, really strong magic. They've got magicians as well. It could, and it just felt like a little bit, okay, this is a strange kind of thing to go down. I accepted it, but again, it was just, I kind of accept those things as a little bit of the quirks of his writing sometimes, where you get these really well written periods and then you've got these kind of little books you feel like, well, just edit that out and just say they just go in, because it didn't feel like it added too much to the story.
But that was the only magic that Nicodemus did.
Yeah. Open the bolts, and then didn't Harmus just rebolt them when because they shut the door?
Just
shut the door. Right, come on.
And then once they're in the fortress, this is where we get the real climax of the story, where they confront Yastareth, the Plague Demon, the Nurgle Chaos Demon. It has taken the form of Asmunda, the woman that could have seduced Harmis if she'd wanted to. She sort of had a sort of power over him. But then they kind of have this conflict, a battle of wills almost, where he's kind of offered a deal by Nurgle and he rejects it. And then we get to the sort of final conflict in the throne room, where Yasareth's true form is revealed as a greater demon of Nurgle. We found out a little bit about this was a human who hates the Cyprian Empire because they killed her brother.
Her brother was killed, yeah.
Yeah, and she blames everybody. She blames the prince. She blames the society itself. That's why she wants to bring the whole thing down. And then there's the sort of final moments, which I really liked. I mean, what were your thoughts on that final conflict? How did you feel about it?
I think they were fine. I think that the film reverted back to that same 80s fantasy film that we started with the setup. So we got that grim medieval in the middle, and we're back to that kind of fantasy film. I think it was fine. It did the job. There's not too many ways you can deliver that kind of ending in that kind of meet the big baddie kind of room. There's a throne there. They're in a big throne room, and it's kind of there's going to be a fight. There's going to be a battle. One of the goodies may not make it. Spoilers. It's the bad magician freeing Averil up for a future partnership, as in marital partnership with for the woman who you always thought was too plain, according to the rest of the book. But yeah, for someone who just basically won a kingdom, he settled quite low based on his opinions for the rest of the book, didn't he? It was a little bit strange. But in terms of the end fight, the big baddie fight, it was over relatively quick. I didn't mind that. I kind of, didn't mind the book coming to a close in that sense by then. There was a convenient open wound in the demon prince, just opening above the heart. There was elements of Smaug again, referring to Lord of the Rings, elements of a missing scale over the heart, and throwing the one remaining dagger. Because Averil's already thrown the other one, didn't she? In a fit of rage, thrown it and missed. She grabbed it.
Yeah, but I think the other one was already, its power
was
had
a bit
been
weaker,
because he'd used it when he shouldn't have. Yeah, I mean, what I liked about this final moment, I did like that it was quite short, because I think they're kind of drawn out. It's very difficult to do. Certainly a magical duel where no one's got any magic, and a chaos demon, greater demon of Nurgle could just kill these three very easily in the game. So how do you bring that to life in a dramatic fashion? And the way they did it was to have the demon is sort of just doing some spell that's affecting all three of them. They clasp hands, and Nicodemus sacrifices himself and sort of sends his entire magical essence, what little of it we've seen and there is, through Averil, and then through her hand and into Harmis, gives him enough power to be able to sort of break free from the spell and throw the dagger. So I quite liked that Nicodemus did sacrifice himself in a noble fashion. He used the magic in the only way he sort of could effectively, and Harmis still had to throw the dagger to do something. So I quite liked that they both got something to do. Averil, it feels like could have been used, could have had more to do, would have been nice. She can create light, and it didn't really do an awful lot in that sequence. But it kind of
it's having one spell in a D&D game that's never any use. I'm going to use this spell. That doesn't work.
There's a sort of Guardians of the Galaxy finale moment, and I apologize for spoilers to anybody who's not seen it, but the team taking each other's hands and together triumphing over a superior enemy. I quite liked that, and obviously this predates that
it was
by
fine.
quite some
It was
way.
cool.
Yeah,
And it kind of made some sense because on their own, individually, they weren't really strong
no
enough.
one's been amazing so far.
I thought that it would be more of I assumed it was going to be some kind of distraction thing that enabled him to deliver the killing blow. But this kind of worked in a similar way, I suppose. But just a distraction with power.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then we get the end
Nicodemus
of the story.
good at opening doors and holding hands.
Yeah, I mean it's sad. It's a sad end for Nicodemus. We didn't really get to know him very much. He was supposed to be a very cool, very effective bowman because we see his handiwork at the start, but he's injured. His arm is injured, so he never fires a bow again in the rest of the story. He only does these very few. Exactly. Very few magic spells. But then he does come good and sort of sacrifice himself at the end. There's a very odd in the final sort of approach to the fortress. We do get from Harmes's perspective. He does say that Averil and Nicodemus made love that night. And
yes, and
an odd detail for him to have included, it seems. One thing I did forget to mention was that Harmes on the journey had also seen some children who'd been affected by the plague and sort of abandoned and were ill. And that memory comes back to him during the final confrontation. And that's what gives him enough power to sort of overcome the Plague Daemon.
Yes.
I quite like that as well. There's
quite a few descriptions like that of that kind of wanting to get revenge.
Yeah.
And some of the attacking with the traveler, getting revenge when he did attack the Zani's camp after they made camp after killing all the traveler family was to kind of a little bit of revenge there. And there was a girl left alive that had been mistreated. And the implication was, in more all the nasty ways you could imagine. And she was dying and Nicodemus was able to kind of put her to sleep so that she died without any pain. So there was elements of humanity brought in throughout. So that was good. I quite like that side. But there was, again, it's the writing, isn't it? With the weird comments like why have that paragraph when you were listening to them making love and feeling a bit jealous. It's a bit like the bit with Averil when he comments about the reason Averil must not like Asmunda to start with is because she's pretty and Averil's not, and it's the way that all plain women think about pretty women. It's like, what a weird place to go in the story. Anyway, it's not required, it's not needed, and it just kind of underpins all that and must describe every woman and rate them on their attractiveness.
Which, if you want to see it as that's Harmes and his view of the world, he's a rugged soldier. He by his own admission is not very good with women. He doesn't understand the opposite sex at all. I think there's a way of reading it where it's all from Harmes's perspective, and it's a defense mechanism. That's why he keeps on saying Averil is not attractive, because he actually does quite like her, and he wants to put her down
where the whole setup goes wrong.
Yeah,
because it should be Orfeo's story.
Yeah,
then it makes sense, but because Orfeo's telling someone else's story. And I, as a reader, forgot or chose to forget that a lot of the time because it actually makes the story better. We never returned
to Orfeo until the very end as well.
We did epilogue,
in the previous story, we got a bit of a break
in the middle. Zaragoza. I did expect it actually. I did think we're going to get to the middle at some point where they stop for tea and sandwiches, and he's going to ask for.
But they don't here, do they? It just goes right the way through, and then you get to the end of this story where now that the Chaos Demon is dead, Nicodemus is dead, the prince is dead, there's been devastation across the empire, but we're left with this moment of Harmes and Averil basically on the throne, and the few remaining people come to them. He thinks they've been drawn to her magic, but she says no, it's hope that they've been drawn to. And that's where the story ends. And then there's a little bit of the sort of framing device again, where Al-Qadi Nazarene, who's been hearing the story from Orfeo, sort of is a bit annoyed that Orfeo ends the story there when it turns out Averil and Harmes get married and Harmes becomes the prince of the Cyprian Empire.
Yeah.
And Nazarene's like, that's the end of the story. Why did you end it before that bit? And Orfeo says, wow, because that line about hope was the real dramatic ending. I mean,
Yeah.
do you think that
It's
Orfeo's
weird.
right? Or do you think that Nazarene's
I
right?
just thought that whole bit was weird. Why would you have that as part of the story? Is this a conversation that he had with his editor and he's decided to act it out in the prologue? Because it doesn't make any sense to have that as part of the story. The story's ended and you've got two other characters arguing about how the story should end, and it's not even that important. It's very weird.
Yeah, I think it's
weird.
a slightly missed execution, I think, because
it goes on as well, because the argument gets repeated for you think they've said their piece, and then it carries on for a second page, and then both repeating the same argument.
And there was actually, I don't know if you had this in the edition that you read, there was a printing error in the edition I read where 2 paragraphs of the argument are repeated. So
maybe that's what it was.
And I actually, the argument then it loops back on itself because of this misprint.
Oh, maybe maybe that's what I read. I'm thinking, I just thought this is just bad.
But it's an unusual choice, and I think it would have worked better if the framing device was more integral to the story we're being told. Because then the question about, because Nazarene is annoyed because he's not sure he's learned anything about chaos. He doesn't know why his brother turned to chaos and what chaos does to seduce you. And you can kind of see, well, that's fair, because we haven't really learned a lot about chaos here, and it's a different chaos god, and they work in a different way, and the nature of their tales very different to what happened in Zaragoza. So Orfeo's story hasn't really enlightened Nazarene at all, and then this unusual, I'm going to end on a note of hope versus I'm going to end on a note of sort of conclusive ending, closure. It's an interesting choice for Orfeo to have made. I just don't feel like we as an audience can know why Orfeo made it. So that's why the debate doesn't make sense, I think, is because why did Orfeo choose to do it? I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. I think I just saw them as 2 separate stories that were kind of mangled together, and it just maybe the reason Nazarene's asking all these questions is because he's flirting with the idea of doing something with some chaos gods himself, and that's what the third story.
Well, that's
the reason I wanted to ask is let me just introduce you to my friend.
That's what does prompt an interesting thought for me, or at least sort of leave me excited about what might come next. But I much like Conrad, the other trilogy of Warhammer fiction, my fear here is that the third part of the trilogy is not going to be a satisfying conclusion to what we've had before, because Zaragoza sets up Orfeo and we get to find out who he is. Then this story, it does something different, and it doesn't quite make sense in Orfeo's tale, but it as its own story is fine and interesting, I think. It feels like the third part of the trilogy then needs to use the 2 stories we've already heard to sort of craft something more meaningful in this third.
That's why it would be interesting if maybe that was the case, is that
if it was Nazarene becoming
and there's a story with them both involved throughout, would make it interesting, and would I'm sure it'd be weird at times, but that's what, if I was going to, what would I like to see? That's probably what I'd like to see. Because if we're going to have those characters just bookending another odd story, then that's fine, as long as the story in the middle is okay, I suppose.
But it does feel
starts a little bit quicker. Because I don't enjoy the framing, but I could almost accept that it is what it is, but it's not an Orfeo trilogy. Especially, what's weird is if it was Orfeo, if the first book was the same thing, with Orfeo was just this kind of narrator that kind of, you see it using loads of films, don't you? The narrator opens the story, he's reading it, like beginning of Never-Ending Story, when you get bits where he's reading the story out loud, and then and you get those breaks in the middle, don't you? When he's tired and has to have something to eat, and then you go back into the world again. So that works. if that's what you're doing. But to have your first novel as Orfeo, as the main character, and then suddenly you think he's a character in this, and then hang on a minute, it's just about something else. Now, which way do they go? The cool thing to do would be to save that and bring it back, and Orfeo be the main character again, even though I'm not particularly attached to him being the character.
But there's questions about Orfeo, like his childhood with the wood elves, and there's more I would like to know. No, I don't think it will, and I think that's what's going to be a shame. I mean, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, and I should just look forward to what it could be, because I do think there is a third book here that could be really interesting, that draws on cool ideas from Zaragoza and cool ideas from Plague Daemon, and takes it to a third place that's interesting.
So where else is he going to go that's not been covered in the
Yeah, that feels more likely is we're going to be in Albion, and we're just going to have a story about some random stuff that never happens ever again. And that would be a shame, I think. But
do you know any stories about some druids? Wow, funnily enough.
There was, as much as there are flaws in this story for me, I think there's enough here. Like I said, the coin, the plague, the tarn wine, and the storm magic, all of that I really, really enjoyed. And it definitely left me, it got me to a place where I was like, yeah, you know what? These are cool ideas. And some of these ideas are executed really well, even though I don't like all of the characters necessarily, and some of the structure didn't work for me. There's more than enough for me to sort of walk away satisfied by this as a book. More so than Zaragoza, I think. I mean, where would you sort of place it alongside Zaragoza?
I think I prefer it to I think I prefer that good chunk from about page 90 to 100 to the end more than Zaragoza, because that felt enough Warhammer. Yes, I think he overstepped on his interpretation of the Border Princess a little bit, but it was believable enough that it could be the Border Princes, and you know, some really simple changes, just like the naming conventions that you brought up. You make them make the marauders, call them Chaos Marauders, call the Chaos things what they are. Actually, yes, that suddenly feels a lot more Warhammer as well. And then you've just got the weird sort of plot devices, the whole framing of it, which is a little bit strange. I don't know. I think it's half of it is probably better than Zaragoza.
But only half.
But overall, I don't know if it's a less rounded book because of it. I don't know. The other one felt like it wasn't Warhammer, but it had a different, unusual charm to it, of its time charm. Whereas this felt like there were more of the tools there to make it more like Warhammer, but still didn't quite hit the mark. I still feel, I can't help feel that he's writing stuff he doesn't really want to write. And that just comes across, and he's trying to write stories, write a story he could have set anywhere and again, and just pick a few Warhammery locations off a map and some names and things here and do it. So if you think of it in reverse to what I just said, so you keep all of those names and you remove chaos from it on all of the Warhammer terms, does the story still work? 100%, I think.
Yes.
You remove all Warhammer references and it just reads as a very normal fantasy novel, doesn't it? Sure. Whereas some Warhammer would feel strange. You go, well, I know they've clearly described this. I wonder if you read the description of the Plague Daemon without the words Plague Daemon and you just thought monster.
Yeah, I think that's...
aside from that, anything else would have been medieval, straight generic fantasy.
I think that's fair point.
So I feel that he's just writing generic fantasy to a brief, doing his job, earning his money, and and some of it written very well. Just there's some weird nuances to it, but it's just weird.
I think I probably was more, even despite my initial reservations from the framing device, some of the earlier stuff, because it was called Plague Daemon and because it was about a Plague Daemon, that definitely gave me more of a sort of foothold to cling on to, I think. It made it feel more Warhammery instantly for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just this is the box tree one, but just having that brilliant picture on there.
Yeah.
Helps set you up.
Nurglings as well. We talked about before we got on the recording. There's a lot of
the little
nurglings at the top of each chapter
It'd be
heading.
nice if some appeared in the story, but yeah, you got these little nurglings. But and there was mention of goblinoid type creatures. There were points where they could have, and that's the other thing. I was hoping probably at the end for there to be more than just the one demon. I was hoping to see nurglings or that kind, more of that kind of proper grossness of Nurgle, not just. It was very much
there's a slimy dungeon.
As a plague, yeah, there is. I suppose, but it's not a lot going on. And is there? It's just a bit slimy, and the rest is more subtle. It's well, we've turned it into plague rather than, and maybe it was back then. I don't remember. That well how it was portrayed at the time. Feel like there was more. Well, you can see there was more because that artwork's of the era as well.
I can absolutely understand why people wouldn't enjoy it and wouldn't feel that it's very Warhammery. I mean, in the Patreon discussion when we sort of got together and did our live stream chat about it, one of my patrons, Ryan, didn't want to talk about it, just wanted to share his dismay at the book, and they did not enjoy it at all. And basically, you know, just it had a very negative reaction to it because of the way it was written and because of what was happening in the story. And I can understand that to an extent. I can see why someone would not enjoy it. Somehow, magically, whether or not it's because it's called Plague Daemon, whether or not it's because it just has enough of these cool ideas like the coins and the storm magic and stuff. For me, it came together despite some of the stuff that would have put me off and did put me off Zaragoz ultimately.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the original name for the book when it was first advertised was the name of the Plague Demon. It was going to be called Yastareth. So that was in the very first GW Books announcement with all of the different titles that were coming. Yastareth was the name for this book.
That was obviously his name for it, or making a bit of a jump there. But I would imagine
potentially,
his name for it.
May well be, and obviously that's the sort of name of power that the Chaos Demon has, and that is used to sort of defeat it ultimately.
Yeah,
I think
that's fine if it's when they're well-known characters, but you wouldn't have that as the first name. So obviously you have named gods now in the Warhammer universe, but they were named within stories. They became famous either through the game or through other stories before they would have titles named at them.
Zaragoz or Drakenfels, I mean, they're all a bit wild names that have no meaning until you've read the book. True.
I think Drakenfels has got enough of a connection with Dracula that it works, and I don't think there's an issue there. I think Zaragoz, I had no idea. Yeah, and you guessed it was probably a person, but probably a place, but it could be a person. But yeah, I think there were elements that could have been. I mean, the people who died of plague probably should have been rising as some kind of plague zombie kind of thing. True, and that would have made it a lot more Warhammer, and that would have probably what would have happened lore wise. Definitely would now.
That's a very interesting point, actually. I hadn't thought about that at all, but you're right.
There was none of once that army was gone, you'd expect that you spread the plague, people die, and then they become your kind of your beasts of Nurgle, shambling.
They easily could have gone to war with the invading marauders. They don't, even though they're sort of loosely on the same side. There's a big thing about how the hill tribes, then they're agents of chaos. Inadvertently, they're sort of being influenced and manipulated. They're not chaos worshippers themselves. So then if they had been invading and now the plague has got ahead of them, and then there's now a load of whatever Nurgle creatures, then actually that would be a way to stop the invasion and sort of create a new type of threat for Harmis and Averil as they're trying to get to the capital. Yeah, that could have been very interesting as well.
I quite liked that era of Marauder or Norseman almost, wasn't it? They weren't particularly just evil. When you had Chaos Dwarves and you had Norse Dwarves, there was that kind of all became blended together, didn't it?
Yeah.
And it was the same with with humans as well, sort of that kind of blending of Viking raiders into marauders all became one thing. So yeah, I like that. They're maybe more often savage and often became chaos worshipping, but weren't inherently like that. That would have been fine. But a few little things, but that's not what he's about, though. That's not what we should know now. We've read enough of his stories.
I think so. Yeah,
he is going to do what he does, and maybe they read better when you're not trying to connect them with Warhammer.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, yeah, like I say, I think for me, this one had enough Warhammer-ness. I think the border print, the sort of broader point that you make about the Border Prince is totally right. And actually thinking back to even...
I'm being honest with that.
But we've seen the Border Princes in William King's previous short story, and
he described it right, I think.
Yeah, exactly. He's given you the version that becomes the canon version of the Border Princes. It's still early days for Warhammer World, so yeah, there's going to be different interpretations. This one doesn't make it, basically. So yeah. But even despite that, I think there's enough to enjoy. The other thing that was just a fun bit of trivia, I guess, is that this is one of the final books to have a White Dwarf feature. So you get in White Dwarf 125 Warhammer Fantasy roleplay stats for the main characters. So Harmis, Nicodemus, Averil, and Yestereth, the Plague Daemon. So if you want to fill your Wolfrup campaigns with these deep and rich characters, then you can do that using the stats provided. But there's at least one more fun White Dwarf article to come, but we'll talk about that when we get to the book. So overall, are you thumbs up or thumbs down on Plague Daemon?
Did I think I did thumbs down for Saragosse. I can't remember. I don't like to be too negative about them, but I didn't like it. So if we're going to go on, if I'm only allowed to do thumbs up or thumbs down,
that's all you're allowed.
Have to be a thumbs down. Yeah,
that's fair enough.
Thumbs down for me.
Enough. For me, ultimately, it was a thumbs up. Not my favorite of the Warhammer novels. Certainly my favorite Orfeo so far. And I think, as I say, things that I really enjoyed conceptually that added a lot of value to the story for me. There really were moments where it was almost like the light switch flipped, and I went from sort of begrudgingly accepting the book to enjoying the book, and it was a very clearly delineated moment. I think.
I think if that second half kicked off a little bit earlier, I'd feel differently about it. I would just pretend Orfeo was nothing to do with it and enjoy the story for what it was. But it was so slow to get to the point where I was enjoying it that spoilt it with the weird book ending.
Yeah. Which, and I think it's fair enough. Like I say, I'm looking forward to what happens next with Orfeo and whether or not I'm
really excited. I mean, I'm not going to do it, but I'm tempted just to go and pick it up just to see whether there's an epilogue and a prologue that are just Orfeo and see whether the main story's about Orfeo, but I won't. So I'm interested enough and I'm enjoying doing this and reading them and experiencing it. Will I ever read it again? Probably not.
I can imagine reading this one again, actually. I don't think I would read Zaragoz again, but I can imagine reading this one again. In a long time.
Martha just popped up by some boxes behind you perfectly. I was
but we did have, I mean, just to move on slightly, related to the book, obviously, that we've read, Plague Daemon, written by Brian Craig, which is actually the pseudonym of Brian Stableford. Unfortunately, sad news that Brian Stableford did pass away just a couple of days ago before recording. So I did just want to add a quick note just to say that as much as we've been challenged by and we've sort of not always got on with his work on Warhammer, I think they've always been interesting and there's been some really compelling stuff and they've been really worthwhile stories to read. So I did just want to just send our condolences to his family, to his friends, and just to add that, it is sad that one of those early Warhammer minstrels, if you like, one of the earliest voices in Warhammer fiction has now passed away. So I just wanted to make that point before we wrapped up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to be going for next month into another of the Warhammer fiction anthologies. So we're back with some of our favorite so far authors. So we've got Red Thirst. It's going to have a Jack Yeovil story. So Kim Newman's back. We're going to have another William King. There is Nicola Griffiths in there as well. There is another Brian Craig story. And there's a couple of others as well. They all seem to be a bit longer than previous.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say a couple of others. There's only 6 stories.
6 stories, yeah. And I'm looking forward to this one. Yeah, I think there's a lot of authors that I now know I like and versions of the Warhammer world that I know I enjoy. So I'm looking forward to finding out how they explore it more.
Well, I'm sure Red Thirst will be good, and I know Dark Beneath the World is good. And I'm really looking forward to just experiencing the others and finding out that.
Yeah. So, Stu, we can find you at Miniature Realms on all the socials, and you've got Discord, Patreon, all that sort of good stuff. Anything else that you wanted to mention? Yeah.
No, not really. Just if you haven't already, check out the YouTube channel, I suppose. I don't talk about books on there very often. There's lots of painting of toy soldiers, but if you like that kind of thing, then you'll like the channll. If not, probably won't like it. It's probably not for you.
Well, give it a go anyway. I'd say worth a look. But all the links will be in the description below. We've also got my Patreon and Discord. We always do a live stream get together where we talk about the book ahead of recording this. So once we've read it, sort of get a chance to explore some of the ideas, the themes in a bit more detail. It tends to be a sort of longer, sort of decompressed exploration of the books, especially when it's the anthologies, because they do a lot of discussion. There's a lot of time spent. So if you're interested in that, then join my Patreon. And again, links down below. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.